I was always the quiet one in the family, the one people looked at but didn't truly see. In every family picture, I stood at the edge, smiling because that's what was expected, but never really included. My siblings, my older brother Mark, and younger sister Emily, were the stars. My parents poured their attention into them, bragging about their achievements at every dinner, every gathering, every holiday. I, on the other hand, was just there. It wasn't as though I didn't try. I worked hard in school, made decent grades, never got into trouble. I even went out of my way to help around the house, doing dishes when no one asked, folding laundry, cleaning up after meals. But in my family's eyes, those weren't accomplishments. They were just what I was supposed to do. My brother Mark, on the other hand, could flunk 3 classes and still be hailed as brilliant, because he was gifted but distracted. Emily could throw tantrums and break things, and my parents would laugh it off, saying, "She's just spirited." Me, I was responsible, too quiet, too unremarkable. It might sound like I'm exaggerating, but imagine this. When I graduated high school, with honors, my parents didn't throw me a party. They didn't even buy me a cake. They said, "Congratulations, that's great," and then spent the rest of the night talking about how Emily had just been asked to join a cheer squad. 2 weeks later, when Mark barely scraped through his college exams, they invited half the neighborhood to celebrate. That was the kind of imbalance I lived with. The kind that slowly eats away at your sense of worth, until you start to believe maybe they're right, maybe you don't matter. But things didn't get unbearable until my father passed away. He had been sick for a long time, cancer. Watching him waste away was one of the hardest things I'd ever endured. Not because we had been close, but because I had hoped, somewhere deep inside, that maybe in those final days, he might finally see me, that maybe he would look at me with the same warmth he reserved for Mark and Emily, that maybe, when he realized life was slipping away, he would tell me I mattered too. It didn't happen. Not once. In fact, in his last days, he asked me to go fetch Emily, or help Mark with this. He never asked me to sit by him. He never held my hand. And when the funeral came, it was almost as though I wasn't part of the family at all. My mother clung to Mark and Emily, weeping dramatically into their shoulders. People came up to me out of politeness, neighbors, distant relatives asking, "How are you holding up?" But my own family, barely a word, barely a glance. It hurt. God, it hurt more than I can ever describe. But the worst was still to come. 2 weeks later, we sat down for the will reading. I wasn't expecting much. I knew my father didn't think of me the same way he thought of the others. But I thought, maybe a little something, a token, a keepsake, a sign that he hadn't completely forgotten I existed. Instead, I got nothing. The lawyer read the will, with his professional detachment, and with every line, my heart cracked a little more. Mark got the house, Emily got the vacation cabin, and a trust fund. My mother, of course, got the savings and investments. And me? My father had left me a watch. A damn watch. It wasn't even his best one. It was old, scratched, barely ticking. My name wasn't even spoken with the same reverence as Mark's, or Emily's. The lawyer just cleared his throat, said, "And to my name, he leaves his wristwatch." That was it. That was the whole acknowledgement of my existence. After 25 years of being his child, I remember sitting there, trying to keep my face composed, trying not to cry, because crying would give them satisfaction. But inside, I was screaming. I wanted to stand up and shout, "I'm his child too. I was. Is there too? I mattered too." But I didn't. Instead, I watched Mark smirk, and Emily giggle with delight, and my mother beam with pride at her golden children. And that was the moment, sitting in that suffocating lawyer's office, clutching a worthless, broken watch, that something inside me shifted. I had spent my whole life trying to earn their love, trying to prove I was worthy, and in that moment, I realized I never would. They had written me off. They had erased me. But they had made one mistake. They thought I would accept it. They thought I would stay quiet, as I always had, fading into the background, letting them take everything. They were wrong. That day, I swore to myself, if they wouldn't see my worth willingly, then I would show them, in a way they could never ignore. I would rise, I would fight, and I would make sure every single one of them regretted underestimating me. And so, my story of revenge began not out of greed, not even out of anger, but out of a hunger to finally be seen, to finally have my voice heard. They had erased me from the family picture for the last time. The watch sat heavy in my hand, as though its weight was mocking me. A scratched, half-broken relic, the kind of thing you might find tossed in a thrift shop bin for $5. That was my worth, apparently. $5. I went home that night and placed it on my dresser, staring at it for hours. I hated it, but I also couldn't throw it away. It was proof. Proof of what my father thought of me. Proof of what my family believed I was worth. Every time I looked at it, the anger in me grew a little sharper, a little hotter, until it was less grief and more fuel. But anger alone wasn't enough. I had to decide. What was I going to do? Confront them? Demand a bigger share? The thought of sitting across from Mark, with his smug grin, or Emily, with her careless laugh, made me sick. They would twist my words, accuse me of being ungrateful, maybe even call me greedy. And my mother, God, my mother, she would just look at me with that expression she always wore, disappointment, mixed with pity. No, I couldn't go to them. I couldn't beg for scraps. So instead, I turned inward. For weeks, I worked my regular job by day, answering phones at a logistics company, and spent my nights researching everything I could about inheritance law, property ownership, and trust funds. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but I knew there had to be something. Some weakness, some loophole, some way to fight back. The deeper I dug, the more I realized just how much wealth my father had actually left behind. Real estate holdings, investments, accounts, spread across 3 different banks. It wasn't just comfortable, it was millions, and all of it had been neatly divided between my siblings and mother, as though I were a stranger, a footnote. And then, one night, while scrolling through property records online, I found something that made me sit up straight. The vacation cabin. It had been in the family for decades. A small but beautiful place in the mountains. We'd spent summers there when I was a kid, swimming in the lake, roasting marshmallows, watching fireflies. Some of my few happy childhood memories were tied to that cabin. And in the will, it had been left entirely to Emily. But the deed still had my name on it. Apparently, years ago, when my father refinanced the cabin, he'd put it under joint ownership with all 3 of his children to secure a better rate. It was a detail no one remembered, or maybe no one cared about, but the paperwork was right there, filed with the county clerk's office, and unless someone formally transferred my share, I was still legally part owner. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. It wasn't much, but it was something. A foothold, a starting point. The next day, I took the documents to a lawyer. Not the same one who had handled the will. I didn't trust him, but a sharp, young attorney I found through sheer determination. Her name was Natalie, and the moment she saw the papers, her eyes lit up. "You realize what this means, right?" she asked, tapping the deed with her manicured finger. "They can't sell, renovate, or even rent out this cabin without your consent. Legally, you own 1/3 of it." The words sent a thrill through me. 1/3. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to remind me that I wasn't powerless. "So, what do I do?" I asked. Natalie leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "That depends. Do you want to cash out quietly? Or do you want to make them sweat?" I didn't even hesitate. I want them to sweat. And so, the game began. Within a week, Emily called me, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Hey," she said, drawing out the word like we were best friends. "So, listen, I heard from Mum that you're making some kind of claim on the cabin. That's silly, right? I mean, Dad left it to me." I could almost see her pout through the phone, the way she always did when she wanted something. For years, that pout had gotten her everything she wanted. But not this time. "It doesn't matter what Dad wanted," I said evenly. "Legally, I still own part of it, and I'm not giving it up." There was a pause, then a sharp edge crept into her voice. "You don't even use the cabin. You don't care about it. Why are you doing this? Because it's mine too. I wanted to scream. Because I'm tired of being erased. Because for once, I want to watch you squirm. Instead, I said, because it's my right. She hung up on me. 2 days later, Mark showed up at my apartment. He didn't even bother knocking politely. He pounded on the door like a cop. When I opened it, he barged in, all broad shoulders and arrogance, the smell of expensive cologne filling my tiny living room. Cut the crap. He snapped. Emily's upset. Mum's upset. Just sign the papers and walk away. Dad didn't want you to have anything, okay? Don't make this harder than it needs to be. His words stung, more than I wanted to admit. Dad didn't want you to have anything. That was the part that echoed in my head, long after he left. But instead of breaking me, it hardened me. I looked Mark dead in the eyes and said, "Number, I'm not signing anything." His face turned red, and for a moment I thought he might actually hit me. But instead, he muttered something under his breath and stormed out, slamming the door so hard my picture frames rattled. I stood there in the silence afterward, my heart pounding, and realized something. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just letting them walk over me. I was standing my ground. It felt terrifying. It felt exhilarating. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Because if a broken watch was all they thought I was worth, then I was going to use that same broken watch as the ticking reminder that their time was running out. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about power, about dignity, about making them face the truth they'd spent years ignoring. I was no longer the invisible child. I used to think my mother's favoritism toward my sister was just something I had to endure, like bad weather that eventually passes. But after that night, the night when she slapped me for daring to stand up for myself, I realized something. This wasn't temporary. This was who she truly was. And the mask she wore, the one of a caring mother, had begun to crack in my eyes. From the outside, people thought we were a normal family. At school, my friends envied me because they assumed I had it all. A roof over my head, food on the table, a mother who smiled at parent-teacher meetings. But they didn't see the invisible lines drawn in our home. My sister, Clara, was the star, the chosen one. She got the praise, the gifts, the love. I got silence, chores, and the reminder that I wasn't enough. After that slap, I stopped trying to win my mother's affection. Something inside me hardened. I decided if I couldn't have her love, I would build my strength from her rejection. So, I studied harder, not for her approval, but for my own survival. I stayed up late reading, dreaming of a life where I didn't need anyone's permission to exist. Clara, of course, noticed the change. She thrived on seeing me small, quiet, and ignored. But now, when she tossed her snide remarks, "Don't you wish Mum loved you the way she loves me?" I didn't flinch the same way. I stored those words, letting them fuel me. But Clara wasn't satisfied with just my silence. She wanted my destruction. One day, she stole an essay I had written for a school competition and turned it in as her own. She won first place. Everyone clapped. The teachers praised her brilliance, and my mother beamed with pride. I wanted to scream, to expose her, but when I told the truth, no one believed me. My mother even accused me of jealousy. "Why can't you just be happy for your sister?" she scolded. That was the moment I understood. In this house, truth didn't matter. Only appearances did. Clara had learned how to manipulate that game, and my mother played along willingly. Still, I didn't give up. Instead, I started writing in secret. Journals filled with my thoughts, my pain, my dreams. It was the only place where I wasn't invisible. In those pages, I was strong. I was heard. I was someone who mattered. And I promised myself, one day, the world would know my side of the story. The cracks in my mother's mask grew wider. I saw how desperately she clung to Clara's achievements, as though living through her daughter's fake successes validated her own worth. She didn't see the truth that Clara's victories were built on lies and theft. But I saw. I always saw. And every time I caught Clara, smirking at me, her eyes daring me to fight back, I whispered silently, "Your day will come. Both of yours will." Because the invisible child was learning how to see everything, and I would remember it all. The older I grew, the more I realized invisibility had its advantages. While Clara basked in the spotlight, I learned to observe. I watched how people behaved when they thought no one was looking, how lies slipped into conversations, how my mother's pride in Clara was often nothing more than desperation dressed up as affection. Being ignored gave me freedom. Freedom to see, freedom to think, and freedom to plan. But even with this newfound awareness, the weight of being unwanted gnawed at me. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every cruel word, every moment where I'd been silenced. My chest would ache, with a mix of anger and sorrow. Sometimes, I wanted to scream so loudly that the walls of our house would collapse, that the world would finally hear me, but I didn't. Instead, I bottled it up, each drop of pain forming an ocean inside me. At school, I kept my head down. Teachers barely noticed me, except when they needed someone dependable. I was the one they asked to clean up, to run errands, to help weaker students. Clara, on the other hand, was celebrated. She joined clubs, won competitions, and charmed everyone with her practiced smile. If anyone suspected she wasn't as flawless as she seemed, they never said it aloud. But invisibility also sharpened my ears. I overheard things, like the time Clara's best friend whispered to another girl, "She acts like she's perfect, but she's not as smart as she pretends." Or when a teacher muttered after class, "Clara has potential, but she doesn't put in the effort." Those words were small cracks, tiny truths that validated my own. They reminded me I wasn't crazy. Others could see through her mask too, even if they didn't dare challenge it. The turning point came one afternoon when I stayed late at school to finish a project. In the empty hallway, I saw Clara with a boy, one of the popular seniors. She was laughing, her hand brushing his arm, her face glowing in a way I'd never seen at home. When he walked away, she spotted me watching. Her smile vanished, replaced by a glare sharp enough to cut. "If you tell Mum," she hissed, stepping close, "I'll ruin you. Do you hear me? You're nothing. No one will believe you." Her words stung, but something inside me shifted. For the first time, I realized Clara was afraid of exposure, of losing her carefully crafted image. That fear was a seed, and I planted it deep in my memory, because one day, I would water it. From then on, I kept collecting moments like that, times when Clara's mask slipped, when her lies cracked, when her fear showed. I didn't confront her. I didn't fight. I just observed, recorded, and remembered. At home, my mother continued her charade, doting on Clara, while treating me like a shadow. But I had begun to see her clearly too. Her love wasn't unconditional, it was transactional. Clara gave her pride, and in return, she gave Clara affection. I gave her silence, and so she gave me nothing. But I wasn't going to stay silent forever. I started small acts of defiance, subtle, almost invisible. I hid Clara's homework once, just to see her panic. I corrected a lie she told at dinner, with calm precision, watching my mother's eyes narrow as Clara stammered. These were tiny victories, but they were mine. And with each one, I grew stronger. Because while they thought I was still the invisible child, I was slowly becoming something else entirely. Someone who had patience, someone who had proof, someone who was no longer afraid. And one day, when the time was right, I would show them exactly who I had become. By the time senior year arrived, I was no longer just the quiet shadow trailing behind Clara. I had become something else entirely. An observer who collected secrets. A silent witness who remembered every cruel word, every stolen victory, every lie that had painted me invisible. And now, I was ready to turn all of it into something Clara and my mother could no longer ignore. The school had announced the annual Future Leaders Award, the most prestigious recognition a student could win. It was based not just on grades, but on character, leadership, and community impact. Naturally, Clara set her sights on it. "It's basically mine already," she boasted at dinner, flashing her rehearsed smile. Mother beamed, clapping her hands as if the trophy was already on our mantle. I stayed silent, but inside, I smiled too for an entirely different reason. Because Clara wasn't the only one who had prepared for that award. For months, I had been working quietly, volunteering at the library, helping younger students after class, starting a small writing group where kids who felt invisible could share their words. I didn't announce it, didn't brag, didn't even tell my mother, but the teachers noticed, the principal noticed, and most importantly, the students noticed. Clara, meanwhile, relied on her charm, her looks, her fabricated image, but charm had cracks. People remembered the way she mocked me at the talent show. They remembered the whispers of her cheating. They remembered moments she thought were forgotten. And I had evidence to make sure they wouldn't forget. Over the years, I had collected pieces, screenshots of her lies on social media, copied homework she had stolen, even recordings of her belittling others. I never used them, until now. The week before the award committee's decision, I made a choice. I didn't want to destroy Clara. I wanted the truth to stand where lies had once reigned. So, I slipped an anonymous envelope under the principal's door. Inside were documents, proofs, testimonies from others who had quietly suffered under Clara's cruelty. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. When the day of the award ceremony came, Clara wore her brightest smile, her perfect dress, her air of entitlement. Mother sat in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. I sat quietly in the middle, my hands folded in my lap, my heart steady. The principal stepped onto the stage, holding the envelope. His voice was calm, but his words were a storm. He spoke about leadership, about character, about how true leaders don't step on others to rise. He spoke of dishonesty, cruelty, and manipulation, and how the school could not, in good conscience, reward such behavior. Clara's smile faltered. Whispers spread like wildfire through the auditorium. Mother's face drained of color. And then, the principal called my name. The applause that followed was deafening. For the first time in my life, the spotlight turned toward me. People saw me not as the invisible child, but as someone who had endured, who had quietly built herself into something unbreakable. Clara's face was pale, her hands shaking. She looked at me as though she didn't recognize me at all. Mother sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, her perfect image shattered in front of everyone. In that moment, I didn't feel hatred. I didn't even feel triumph. I felt freedom. For years, they had tried to erase me, but I had written myself back into existence. And the best part? I hadn't needed to scream, or fight, or beg. All I had done was tell the truth. But the story wasn't over yet. One final chapter remained, the one where I decided what to do with my newfound power. The house had become a battlefield of unspoken words and sharp glances. Every time I walked through the narrow hallway, I felt the weight of judgment pressing against me from the walls themselves. My mother's silence had grown sharper than any insult, her eyes cutting through me whenever we crossed paths. My father, once a distant shadow, now seemed more present, but only to remind me of my place, or lack thereof. It was in the little things that the betrayal of family revealed itself. At dinner, they no longer placed a plate for me. When relatives visited, I was either locked away in my room or sent on pointless errands, just to ensure my existence didn't stain their carefully crafted image of unity and love. They lived in denial, and I was the sacrifice that made their illusion possible. But what they didn't realize was that the silence they had built around me was cracking. Every act of cruelty, every neglectful moment, every whispered conversation that abruptly stopped when I entered the room. It was fuel for the fire burning within me, a fire that demanded to be seen, to be heard, to claim space in a family that had rejected me long ago. One night, when the house was thick with tension, my father returned late. His voice thundered through the thin walls as he argued with my mother about money, about appearances, about things that seemed meaningless to me now. But in his rage, he spoke truths that sliced through the air like daggers. "You protect everyone but her," he yelled. "You'd rather starve yourself than admit she deserves the same as the others. Do you even see her? Or has she become your shame?" I sat frozen, in my room, trembling. For the first time, someone had named the wound. Shame. That was what I had been reduced to. Not a daughter, not a sister, but a living reminder of something they wished they could erase. The next day, the atmosphere was heavier than ever. My mother avoided me completely, her face pale and lips pressed thin. My siblings stole glances at me, a mix of pity and fear in their eyes. But none dared to speak. I wanted to scream at them, shake them, demand that they acknowledge me. But instead, I swallowed the storm inside me. It was in those silent hours that I began writing, on scraps of paper, in the margins of old notebooks, on the margins, backs of discarded bills. Words poured out of me, like water bursting through a dam. I wrote about the invisible girl who could scream without sound, who could burn without flames, who could disappear without anyone noticing. I wrote her into existence, and with every word, she became more real and I less alone. But words alone could not heal the breaking point that was coming. The night it happened was unremarkable at first. The power had gone out again, plunging the house into darkness. We lit candles, the flickering light painting strange shadows on the walls. My mother sat at the table, her face unreadable. My father paced, muttering under his breath. My siblings whispered in corners, their voices a soft hum. And then, as if carried by the silence itself, my voice broke free. "Why do you hate me?" The words shattered the air. Everyone froze. The candles flickered. My mother's eyes snapped to mine, wide with disbelief, as though she had forgotten I could speak at all. My father stopped pacing. My siblings stared, mouths open, caught between shock and relief. I stood, my hands trembling, but my voice steady. "I did nothing to deserve this. I'm not your mistake. I'm not your shame. I'm your child, but you've treated me like I don't exist." My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. Tears welled in her eyes, but whether they were of guilt or anger, I couldn't tell. My father slumped into a chair, his face buried in his hands. My siblings looked from one parent to the other, desperate for someone to say what they couldn't. But the silence that followed was louder than any scream. I realized then that they might never give me the answers I needed. They might never see me, never love me, never give me the place I had been denied all these years. The breaking point wasn't theirs, it was mine, and I had crossed it. From that night, I stopped waiting for their acknowledgement. I stopped begging for scraps of love, and started gathering the fragments of myself they had tried to bury. The invisible child had spoken, and though the house returned to silence, I knew something irreversible had shifted. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield had changed. The morning after my breaking point felt eerily calm. The house moved on as though nothing had happened, as though my words had been swallowed by the dark and erased with the rising Sunday. My siblings busied themselves with schoolwork. My father left early for his endless grind, and my mother scrubbed the kitchen counter until her hands turned raw. But I was not the same. I sat in my room, the words I had spoken echoing inside me, louder now than they had been when they escaped my lips. "Why do you hate me?" That question had hung in the air like smoke, choking everyone who had heard it. They had refused to answer, but their silence had told me enough. I was never going to get the closure I craved. For years, I had waited for them to see me, really see me, to recognize the ache behind my eyes, the hunger in my chest, the longing in my voice. But their vision was clouded by pride, fear, and shame. And so, I came to the only conclusion that made sense. If I was invisible to them, then I had to make myself visible elsewhere. That night, I made a decision. I packed a small bag with a few belongings that mattered. My scraps of writing, the notebook where I'd bled my soul onto paper, the single photograph I had of myself as a child, a picture where I stood off to the side, cropped at the edges, half smiling while everyone else was centered. It was proof, at least to me, that I had existed all along. I slipped out of the house in silence, the air thick with the weight of finality. The street was quiet, the stars hidden behind a veil of clouds. Every step I took away from that house felt like tearing through invisible chains that had bound me for years. My heart pounded, but with each beat, I felt freer. The city greeted me with indifference, but even that was kinder than the cruelty of home. I found myself wandering through streets I had never walked before, clutching my bag like it contained my entire identity. And perhaps it did. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew it had to be somewhere other than where I came from. I found refuge in a small, forgotten library, tucked between two abandoned shops. The smell of old paper and dust wrapped around me like a blanket. The librarian, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, didn't ask questions when I lingered for hours. She simply let me exist. That was all I had ever wanted. There, surrounded by stories of others who had endured, survived, and risen. I realized that my own story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The invisible child was learning to write herself into visibility. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, I built a life outside the shadow of betrayal. I took odd jobs, shelving books, sweeping floors, helping at the corner store, anything that would keep me afloat. With every paycheck, no matter how small, I bought pens and notebooks. Words were my lifeline, my rebellion, my salvation. I poured my story onto the page, not to seek revenge, but to preserve the truth. Because if my family refused to acknowledge my existence, I would make sure the world could. And then, one day, I returned. It wasn't out of longing or weakness, but strength. I stood outside the house that had both raised and erased me. The windows looked the same, the paint peeling, the garden unkempt. My siblings were older now, my parents warier, but the atmosphere hadn't changed. When the door opened, my mother stood frozen in the frame. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw the storm of emotions she kept buried. Guilt, anger, sorrow. She whispered my name, a sound so fragile, it could have been broken by the wind. But I didn't step inside. I came to say goodbye. I told her, my voice steady, not because I just need you, but because I need to let go. Her lips quivered, as though she wanted to respond, but the silence stretched on. My siblings appeared behind her, their faces pale, their eyes darting between us. My father emerged too, his posture stooped, his expression unreadable. I looked at them, all the family that had betrayed me, denied me, abandoned me, and I realized something astonishing. I felt no hatred, only release. "You'll never see me the way I needed you to," I continued, "but that doesn't mean I'll disappear. I'm not invisible anymore. Not to myself, and not to the world." I turned, before they could answer, before silence could once again consume me. My feet carried me away, lighter this time, stronger. The invisible child had walked into that house years ago, but the woman who walked away now carried her own name, her own voice, her own story, and in that final goodbye, I was reborn.